I was 11 in 1976. I was the same age that my youngest son, Seth, is now, which means that he is growing up in a world with half as many butterflies as the one I grew up in. Hi, I'm here today to talk to you about insects and my new book, Silent Earth, which is all about insects. It's partly sad because it's about the declines of insects and what's causing them, but it's also about what we can all do to help, so it's not all doom and gloom. So I've been interested in insects all my life. They're amazing things. Come in this extraordinary array of shapes and sizes and colours. We know of over 1 million different species, and there are many more awaiting discovery. I've been interested in them since I was a kid. This isn't me, this is my son Seth, who's 11. And there he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin. He's in his kind of bug phase at the moment, which I love, and long may it continue. But the sad truth is, although I think many kids go through a bug phase, most of them, sadly, they grow out of it. You know, by the time they're teenagers or adults, they're frightened of insects. If anything flies near them, they're likely to flap at it and try and kill it. They think it's going to bite them or sting them, which is really sad, because not only are insects amazing and wonderful, as I've said, but also they're really important. So my mission in life, if you like, is to try and persuade people to love insects, or at the very least to respect insects, because they're, as I say, we need them. And I'll come back to why we need them later. But before I do, let's talk about their declines. So there is a depressing and growing body of scientific evidence showing that biodiversity worldwide is in decline, and that particularly insects seem to be in really rather rapid decline. So here, for example, are data from the UK. This shows you our populations of butterflies, with the commoner species at the top and the rarer species at the bottom. Which we've been carefully monitoring since 1976. And as you can see, they've fallen. Sadly, butterfly populations in the UK are overall down by about 50% since 1976. So coincidentally, I was 11 in 1976. I was the same age that my youngest son, Seth, is now, which means that he is growing up in a world with half as many butterflies as the one I grew up in the 1970s, which is quite a sad thought, and of course leads one to thinking about, you know, what will his children experience, what will be their idea of what is normal in terms of numbers of butterflies or bees or birds or whatever. It isn't just UK butterflies that are declining. I'll just show you one other graph. I could show you many more from around the world, but this shows you data from Germany. This is collected by amateur entomologists, or mainly amateurs, who have been putting Malaise traps all over German nature reserves scattered across Germany since the late 1980s. A Malaise trap catches all types of flying insect. You can see one at the top right there. And the chart shows you the weight, the mass of insects caught per day, per trap, between 1989 and 2016. And most alarmingly, it fell by 76%. So seemingly 3/4 of the flying insects of Germany disappeared in just 26 years, really not very long at all. Which, you know, actually when these data were published in 2017, it set sort of alarm bells ringing around the world, and this was widely covered in newspapers and so on, which at least was something good, I guess. Anyway, why does it matter if insects are declining? Well, firstly, as I've already mentioned, they make up the bulk of life on Earth. More than 2/3 of all species on our planet that we know of are insects of one type or another. They're also food for a very large proportion of the remaining creatures, most birds, bats, lots of other small mammals, lizards, amphibians like frogs and toads, and freshwater fish, trout and salmon and so on. They all rely upon insects for food. So if the insects disappear, then they're going to disappear too. But insects aren't just important as food. They perform all sorts of really vital roles in ecosystems. They recycle dead bodies and dung and dead trees and leaves, and that recycling releases nutrients so that more plants can grow each year. They're biocontrol agents of crop pests. Admittedly, also often the pests themselves are different types of insects. They help to keep the soil healthy, they distribute seeds, they do all sorts of things. Essentially, ecosystems would grind to a halt without insects. But most of this is not appreciated by the majority of people. But one thing I think these days that people do understand, at least to some extent, is pollination. I think most of us realise that insects, bees in particular, are important as pollinators, and of course they are incredibly important. Nearly 90% of all the plant species on our planet need pollinating by some kind of animal, usually an insect. Not always a bee. It's important to stress there are lots of other pollinators: wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, lots of different fly species and so on. And between them they make sure that all these wildflowers set seed and survive. And of course, from a selfish perspective, they make sure that our supermarkets remain full of all these lovely fruits and vegetables that we've grown accustomed to having available 12 months of the year. Things wouldn't look so good if we didn't have bees and other insects to pollinate. We wouldn't have apples, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, tomatoes, all sorts of things. Even coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So life would be pretty tough without them. And actually the horrible truth is that some people would starve. So we need to make sure we don't end up like these people. These photographs were taken in southwest China, where people now have to hand pollinate their apple and pear trees because there aren't any pollinators left to do it for them. They've wiped them out, which is pretty terrifying. And this is happening more and more around the world. I've seen it myself quite recently in India, and there are reports from Brazil and elsewhere of farmers having to turn to pollinating crops by hand because they haven't got any bees or other insects left to do it for them. Which brings me, I guess, to Rachel Carson and Silent Earth. And of course my book, Silent Spring, my book Silent Earth is a sort of deliberately alluding to this. I think the sad truth is that Rachel Carson would turn in her grave if she had any idea what has happened since she published her book 60 years ago. Many people, I think, thought that actually she won this battle. She highlighted the terrible harm that pesticides were doing. Only 15 years after they were first introduced, really, which happened about the Second World War. And she brought attention to chemicals like DDT, for example, which were doing terrible harm in ecosystems. And eventually they were banned. And as I say, many people think that the battle was won. But sadly it wasn't. Those chemicals were just replaced by other chemicals, many, many more of them. And as time has gone on, we've used more and more of them. So in her day, there were perhaps 30 different pesticides available to farmers. In Europe today, there are about 500, globally more than 1,000. Globally, we apply somewhere in the region of 3 million tons of what are essentially poisons to our global landscape every year. In the UK, each farmer's field is sprayed just over 17 times a year. It's little wonder really that insects are in decline. But actually we're lucky in Europe. Our pesticide regulatory system is better than most in the world. In fact, it probably is the best in the world. In the Americas, it's common to spray pesticides from aeroplanes. They have many more products available. They're much more indiscriminate in their use. And in the third world, it's very common to see pesticides being applied by people with no training and very little education, no protective equipment, and often applying chemicals which have been banned in Europe. So I took this photograph in India 3 years ago near Calcutta. This guy is spraying paraquat, which is a herbicide which is banned in Europe because it's incredibly poisonous to people. You only have to drink 1 or 2 drops of it and you will die. And this guy is spraying it on the weeds on his little farm with his hand sprayer, which looks like it was made hundreds of years ago. He's not even got shoes, let alone proper protective equipment. And the really awful thing is that paraquat is manufactured in the United Kingdom. Many pesticides banned in Europe are still manufactured in Europe and sold to the third world, where they have less strict regulation, which is incredibly hypocritical when you think about it. So, all very depressing. Let's turn to something much more positive, which is, what can we do about this? Well, the good news is there is a lot we can do. It's not too late. Most insects have not disappeared. They may have declined in abundance a lot, but they could come back really fast if we did something to help them. And the even better news is that we can all get involved. There are lots of simple things that we can all do, and collectively that would make a huge difference. And you can see the benefits for insects of your actions. Plant the right kind of plant, and as soon as it flowers, bees, butterflies, hoverflies, a whole host of amazing insects will turn up. So, what can we do? Well, there's 2 real areas I'm going to talk about. Firstly, gardening and urban areas, and then I'll say a little bit about farming. When it comes to gardens, I think there are really exciting opportunities. I'm in my garden here in the south of England, and I garden for wildlife, and many people do these days. I don't know the figures for Sweden, but in the UK we have 22 million private gardens, covering an area of, it's about 400,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. And just imagine if they were all managed for wildlife. And not only that, but the local council was on board, and they were managing the road verges and the roundabouts and the city parks and the cemeteries for wildlife, so they're all full of flowers. Collectively, that would be a national network of habitat for insects, which would make a real difference. And this isn't just my kind of idle, crazy pipe dream. This is already happening, which is what's really exciting about it. Lots of people are deliberately making their gardens a little wilder, growing more wildflowers and so on, things I'm going to talk about in a second. So there's a real opportunity, an open door, and there's not really, I don't think, sorry, there's so many birds flying around, there's not really any downside to doing this. There's no real price to pay, apart from perhaps getting used to our gardens looking a little less neat and tidy. It is extraordinary how much life can live in a garden. And I think this is best demonstrated by the work of a lady called Jenny Owen, who wrote a book, The Wildlife of a Garden. And it was based on her own garden in Leicester, which is a city in northern England, North Midlands. It's not a city famed for its wildlife at all. It's very urban, industrial. She had a garden quite near the city centre, and a very small garden. But she spent 35 years encouraging wildlife and cataloguing, counting, identifying every species of animal and plant she could find. And after 35 years, her species list was 2,673 different species of animal and plant. Nearly all of, well, most of them insects, nearly 2,000 of them were different types of insect. I think that's extraordinary. And it just goes to show how much life could live in all of our gardens if we're lucky enough to have one, and we take a few simple steps to encourage it. So what are those steps? So there's 4 ideas on this slide. Firstly, starting top left, try and be a bit more tolerant of what we're taught to describe as weeds. There are many common native and beautiful wildflowers like dandelions and thistles and ragwort and many others, which we spend ages trying to get rid of in our gardens. And actually, if we just learn to be a little more tolerant, the wildlife would really thank us. Dandelions, for example, as here, are a fantastic nectar resource for early spring pollinators. So leave a few in your garden, and actually I would say this, you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by calling them wildflowers. Okay, moving round clockwise, flowering trees. If you've got room, squeeze in a flowering tree or two. You don't need terribly much room because fruit trees are, like apples and so on, are available on dwarfing rootstocks, which means they don't grow very big and can fit in a really small space. Things like apples, pears, cherries, plums and so on are a really wonderful early spring resource again for things like bumblebee queens coming out of hibernation. So try and squeeze in at least one if you possibly can. Then moving around a bit further on the slide, lawns. Don't have a super neat lawn that you mow every 2 weeks. It's just a crazy waste of time. I don't know why people are obsessed by putting stripes in their lawns and mowing the life out of it. If you just relax, and next time you think your lawn is looking a little bit long, instead of getting out the lawnmower, get out a deck chair and make yourself a coffee or a gin and tonic, and enjoy the insects that will arrive to visit the flowers that will pop up. This is my lawn. I'm actually sitting right on the edge of that where that picture was taken right now. And it's full of flowers, and I didn't sow any of them. They just came up when I stopped mowing. And then finally, bottom left, of course, there are lots of mown areas in our cities and towns managed by the local council. They don't have to be like that. They could be like this, full of flowers, and wouldn't that be great? If we did all that, we could support a lot of wildlife in our gardens, and that would be really fantastic. But the bigger issue is, what do we do about farming? Farming covers a much larger area of land than our gardens do. And while that remains hostile to life, and unfortunately the horrible truth is that modern industrial farming is hostile to life, these enormous monocultures of fields, treated over and over again with pesticides, support almost nothing apart from the crop. Now, I think a lot of people think that that's necessary, that this industrial farming method is the only way we can feed the world. If they think about it at all, and I think many people don't, that I would question whether it's necessary or desirable. In fact, I think it's highly dangerous for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, it's undermining its own basis by wiping out biodiversity. Farming needs pollinators, and it needs biocontrol agents, natural enemies of crop pests, and it needs creatures to keep the soil healthy. And yet it is the main driver of their destruction. So it's undermining its own support mechanisms. And similarly, it's also doing terrible damage to soils around the world. About 40% of the world's soils are already badly damaged. The blackbird. How are we going to grow crops if we keep destroying our soils? The next generation will have nothing to grow their food in. And then finally, of course, modern agriculture is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. About 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. And we all know that we have to stop that. So I think this model isn't sustainable, and that we have to find a better way to feed everybody. So what should farming look like? It needs to look after the soil, not just because we need soil for growing crops, but also because soil is a fantastic store of carbon if it's looked after. So we need farming methods that really put soil health up front, and working with nature rather than against it. We've got to stop trying to kill and control everything. We need those pollinators, we need those biocontrol agents. which basically means we need to find ways of farming that minimise or eliminate pesticide use. And of course, whatever we come up with as a system of farming, it has to produce enough food to give us all a healthy diet. That might seem like a pretty tall order, but actually I've seen examples of farms that already tick all those boxes, that provide everything we need, or could if they were done on a big enough scale. Things like agroforestry and permaculture and biodynamic farming and organic farming, they're all based on looking after the soil, growing a diversity of healthy fruits and vegetables close to where they're going to be consumed. They're all sustainable in the long term and offer, I think, a much more attractive way forward than carrying on with this industrial, destructive agricultural process. Whatever we do, we have to do a better job of looking after our planet. It's extraordinary. We live on this rock, hurtling through space with a crust of life clinging to its surface. It's extraordinary and it's unique. It's our home. It gives us everything. And we should treat it as our most valued possession. But we're not. We've done a pretty poor job of looking after it so far, and there is a real danger that future generations will inherit an impoverished Earth, and an Earth that's been shorn of most of its natural beauty, which would be terribly sad. So we have to do better. And what better place to start than by looking after all the little insects that live all around us in our gardens. Thank you very much for listening.